Hi, everyone. So now we're going to do the lecture on Wages Against Housework by Silvia Federici. This can be lined up against Angela Davis's article, The Approaching Obsolescence of Housework. Both tackle the same set of issues, women's relegation to the privatized work of the home. And just a pause to say privatized means that rather than be supported by social structures carried out outside the home, that it's all that reproductive labor, as we're going to call it, is expected to be carried out within the home, to be privatized within the home. So both are talking about the relegation of women to the privatized work of the home, but both have different ideas about how housework and the struggle around housework fits into capitalism and what in turn this means for political strategy. Okay, so we'll talk first about Silvia Federici. So wages for housework is part of the movement that Federici was both, I believe, a founding member, not necessarily a founding member, but one of the founding members. She was there at the moment when the wages for housework movement in the 70s began to coalesce and manifest and actually to adopt actions in the world. And this essay is called Wages Against Housework because what she's trying to do is think about how there's how we can think about wages for housework as a perspective. Okay, so if we think about wages versus housework, we can start to see maybe what is actually going on for women in terms of their relegation to the home, what that means, why that's happening, what it would mean to struggle against it. She's also going to argue that women are an exploited class who are naturalized as housewives. Okay, we can go back to that feminine mystique and Friedan, this positing of women's nature as being of a certain kind, of a certain set of characteristics that lends them to hearth, home, children, love, nurturing, togetherness. And we'll talk about the waging of she'll talk about how the waging of housework refuses the naturalized exploitation of women. So if women demand the wage, or if they ask for wages alongside for their housework, alongside their housework, that they are contesting implicitly their exploitation as women and their exploitation within the economy. Okay. So if we think about wages against housework as a perspective, that gets us to think about it this way, that wages against housework is not necessarily about a lump of money. It's about a political perspective. What we're talking about here is not necessarily money being given to women for them doing housework. We're talking about a complete and thorough contestation of the terms of women's relegation to the home, okay? An analysis of why they are relegated to the home, of who that benefits, of how that hurts women, okay, and how women can struggle against it. So demanding the wage brings into relief both the social and economic relations that underpin the institution of the housewife and render that institution exploitative. Okay, so if we think about wages against housework as a political perspective, that gets us to look at both the economic issues that are in play and the social issues, so the gender issues. Once again, we are going to see that the construction of women as housewives is part of the social construction of gender. Federici is going to take us a step further and say that that is the social construction of gender that directly exploits women. And we can see the political valence of this perspective by thinking about what would happen if women were actually waged for their housework. If they were waged for their housework, again, not just given a lump of money, but given a wage, a social contract where they had where they could negotiate over the terms of their work, this would mean the following things. It would mean that they have the following rights that workers' rights, that first of all, they would be compensated for their labor, that there would be boundaries around their work, that they would have the ability to mobilize as workers, which as atomized individuals in the home, they currently do not. And they would also have the ability to contest their working conditions, and to do so, for example, through striking, but also to contest what counts as their work, okay, and how much they should be doing in a given day, how well they should be doing it, what are the expectations. They would be able to have a say in those rather than it just being foisted on them through a set of expectations that are, as we saw with the Mystique, kind of the normative expectations that are policed in all sorts of ways through subtle censure and insults and snickerings about, say, the state of somebody's house, to outright abuse from a husband who comes home and doesn't have dinner on the table, right? Those are all ways that the normative expectations of the housewife are reinforced. So Federici is going to argue that capitalism positions women as an exploited class within economic and social relations. That it's in the figure of the housewife that gender and capitalist exploitation come together to give rise to a gendered capitalist exploitation. So historically, women have been tasked with the work of social reproduction, which is the activities that nurture future workers, that regenerate the current workforce, maintain those who cannot work. That is the set of tasks that together maintain and reproduce life, both daily and generationally. Women have historically been tasked with this sort of labor. And this is very important labor. It generates what we would call use value. It creates very useful things. It is also, so in the useful things that it creates the food that we eat, recreates the worker, okay, as a source of labor power. Literally, the wife and the work that she does in the home makes it possible for the husband to go to work at the factory. He needs to be fed, cleaned, and fucked, I like to say. Because I do think that sexuality is part of the reproductive, the schema of reproductive labor that we're talking about here. Okay. So under this schema, what it means to be a woman is to essentially be an unwaged reproductive laborer, to do all the work of reproductive labor that is necessary for things in the factory to be made and for capitalist accumulation to happen. But women aren't paid for this, okay? And that's what makes them exploited. We can recall Iris Marion Young's definition of exploitation: when the energy and resources of the have-nots are taken and accumulated to the haves and augmenting the power and resources of the haves. Okay, so just as the factory worker might be exploited in the factory, so the wife is exploited alongside him and to some extent by him. But the wife is exploited alongside the factory worker, even though she might not be working in the factory, precisely because she is working in order to get him to the factory so that he can work. So as we saw with the feminine mystique, feminist typo. As we saw with the feminine mystique, housework is constructed as women's work. And for Federici, this is part of capitalism's scheme for women. By denying housework a wage and transferring it into an act of love, which is very much the language of the Mystique, capital has got a hell of a lot of work almost for free. And it has made sure that women, far from struggling against it, would seek that work as the best thing in their life. What Federici is trying to get at here is that housework is constructed as part of what it means to be a woman. so that women will do it free. Okay? Or that the expectations that this is what it means to be a woman are so strong that women cannot militate against it, cannot push against it, because to do so is to not just push against the economic relation that is at work here, to also push against the social relation of gender that is at work here. Okay, so that's two systems of oppression that they're pushing against if they want to contest the unwaged work of housework. So to demand the wage is to show that work is happening and needs to be compensated for. Wages against housework as a perspective reveals housework as a function of capitalism, as something that is essential to profit generation. Hence, Federici writes, to say that we want wages for housework is to expose the fact that housework is already money for capital, that capital has made and makes money out of our cooking, smiling, and fucking. So, given that it is unwaged, to demand the wage is in many respects to refuse both the exploitative nature of that relationship and the naturalized gender order that is implicated therein. As a housewife, women are unable to contest their working conditions or to refuse work without risking censure. And that censure can be little snide remarks, for example, maybe from the mother-in-law. Why doesn't she feed my son like she should be? To outright abuse from a husband who doesn't have his dinner at home, doesn't have his dinner on the table when he gets home. For Federici, because housework is not work, women are prevented from struggling against it. Waging housework renders it work, and this positions women as active economic and social agents. As Federici writes, the wage at least recognizes that you are a worker and you can bargain and struggle around and against the terms and quantity of that wage. So the wage would not just be an economic solution, it would implicitly challenge women's imposed confinement to the home. In this respect, to struggle for the wage is also to struggle against patriarchy alongside a struggle against capitalism. As Federici writes, when we struggle for wages, we struggle unambiguously and directly against our imposed social role. To ask for wages for housework is to refuse that work as an expression of women's nature, and therefore to refuse precisely the female role that capital has invented for women. So to sum up, wages for housework is a demand, wages against housework is a perspective, and what wages against housework as a perspective reveals is that women are an exploited class, both in terms of their gender and economically. Their naturalization as housewives leads to their economic exploitation, as well as their social oppression in terms of gender. And the waging of housework refuses the naturalized exploitation of women. To wage housework means to push against not just the capitalist relations of exploitation that inhere in this role, but also the expectations around gender, that women should be doing this role out of their very nature and not because they are being coerced by a constructed economic system. And I will leave it at that.